thanks so much for that. And I will say that though we're working remotely, I'm just impressed that Holly and I coordinated outfits and didn't even know about it until we just saw each other on Zoom. I mean, so that we are definitely staying connected, being apart. So thanks for that introduction and this opportunity. Again, I'm Amy Jablonski with the Swift Education Center, and Hollie Pettersson here to talk to you about building this equity-based MTSS approach, really through this anti-racist lens. And so we're just gonna go through a little bit and set the stage of just kind of as we begin to talk about, especially in the beginning of today's session, is just to stay as engaged as you can. We know how hard things are right now. The beginning of this session may experience some discomfort, and we ask you to just stay with that as we move through. When we'll have opportunities for some breakouts and also for use of the chat. By the way, please put your questions in during. I think if you save them to the end, we might forget what we said. So just go ahead and put them in whenever, and we'll have that chat box up and going for you all times. And then also this last thing, which I think can be really difficult, which is expect and accept non-closure. And that we're never going to know all the answers to this thing called school. And it's always going to be changing. And we want to leave you today with some nuggets of possibilities and ways to critically begin to challenge our system of education to build this equity-based multi-tiered system of support. Hollie, would you like to say anything else?
Yeah, I just want to add that our session today, we deliberately planned to do what ORTIi does best, and that is to really present ideas for you to think about, but not to tell you what to think. It's really important that we leave space that folks can really form ideas that will help when they go back to their schools and districts to implement.
At the Swift Center, which is based at the University of Kansas, and neither of us live in Kansas, thank goodness, we'd be freezing right now, is that we have a framework, we have features and domains, and we have ways that we go about our work to help sites build an equity-based multi-tiered system of support. I just want to point out that the iconic thing is in the middle, but all the other pieces that are on the sides, as we know as practitioners, are extremely helpful. And today we really want to hone in on administrative leadership that would drive building this equity-based MTSS through an anti-racist approach. So we have a framework. We're not going to go through each of these. And this is where our approach comes from. And Hollie, how about we read it back and forth?
Okay, I'm happy to do that.
Why don't you start?
Okay, so before I start reading it, so that we can make sure we're all on the same page, I do need to say that one of the nice things about working for the Swift Education Center is that they practice what they preach. So in, early June, a lot of organizations came out with a statement after the murder of George Floyd, and many of them have forgotten that statement or moved on to the next flavor of the day. And I'm proud to say that with the Swift Education Center, we really are holding true to what it is we committed to. So Swift Education Center will not be silent about pervasive and systemic racism impacting Black families, Black students, families, and communities.
Today, we deepen our commitment to dismantling inequitable and harmful educational systems and structures.
We will actively and intentionally work with our partner schools to end the ingrained pattern of marginalization and disproportionality that harm students of color and their families.
Today, more than ever, we embrace this imperative. And so you'll see this beginning to set the stage as we have a grounding premise with which we want to have common language of this particular time in education. Hollie, do you want to take it from here and talk about this grounding premise and move us into it?
Yeah, I would love to. So the grounding premise that Amy and I kept in mind as we planned for today's session with you all is the one that is on your screen by Zion and Blanchette. And the things that I would like to call out are, making sure that issues are on the table. That's the only way we're going to see the promise of public ed, the possibilities that it holds. That we are looking at disparities, that we're looking at disproportionality with special education identification, that we're looking at dropout rates, discipline, and that we're looking at the impact of socioeconomic status, immigrant status, and the challenges facing our urban areas. We know with COVID, we've really exposed some long-standing inequities that have disproportionately harmed our Black, Latinx, our low-income students, and our students with disabilities. So that is the lens through which Amy and I want to enter this conversation.
This grounding premise starts with a quick glance back into what we call at Swift schooling in the rear view. And we think of schooling in the rear view, it is taking that look behind us to figure out how in the world did we get here. Now, we're not talking pandemic. That's like, that happened here too. But really, how did we get to this place called school to start with? And just from this overall broad picture, we know as a public education system that it was never created to be equal, and it still has its disparities that continue with our outcomes. So just in broad language, when we look in the rear view, we can take a look on how we have this unequal school system through having schooled versus controlled, quote, a tracking system that we still see today. We have marginalization around race, ethnicity, ability, and language. And you can see, we'll show you in a minute, some other components that are trying to correct this area. And then allocation of funding, supports, and pay. And when we want to think about this from the systemic lens, which we know we do within an ORTIi approach, an MTSS approach, whatever letters you want to put together through that approach, we realize that we have systemic areas to combat. So we want to talk about it from the micro perspective as well as the macro perspective. But to get this big idea of that school started from this unequal schooling system platform. And along the way, there have been course corrections, as we like to call it, to try to change this system over time. And this is a very broad brushstroke here. A very broad brushstroke of different policies, laws that are passed over time. And one thing that you're going to hear as we set this up and how we build this equity-based multi-tiered system of support is that we have to remember that we can't legislate our way out of marginalization, power and privilege, discrimination. We can't legislate our way out of it, but here are examples in which the attempt to legislate our way out of an unequal system have been there. And so we have this pairing of, okay, fine, we've been told we need to do things, but then the result is that so much hasn't changed. Hollie, within this area, do you want to say anything else?
Well, I just want to say that these course corrections, I mean, policy matters. And so the policies have nudged us. They have definitely, I think, increased awareness in some areas. But I wholeheartedly agree with you. We can't solve human problems with a policy solution. It's just part of the approach. And so I feel like the course corrections have been helpful, but we have to call them what they are.
So staying in this idea of what has changed, and as we sit with this paradox of we have these policies trying to enact change, but then we have these marginalized and inequitable outcomes that we have in all of our states. Public ed is an all nation situation that we have. And so as you look at these, when we think about the policies that are trying to be put in place, we have to think there's more of that work that we need to do within that. So in this idea of what has changed is that when we look at this next slide, I just want you to think about, okay, well, we always want to say, well, we've come so far. Oh my goodness, we've come so far. And we have a long way to go, and we always will. And Hollie and I rest in the thing that this thing of school is never going to be solved. We're always going to be solving problems. We're just going to rest with that, right? We always going to be solving problems. We never knew how to do school in a pandemic, or trying to figure it out, right? Just for an example. But when we think about all these forces from the systemic level that are having an impact, we do have to sit with what has changed, really, and before we can begin to think of the possibilities of our next steps. So we're intentionally just letting you view without commentary. So when put together in this way, and we still have at the center, specifically our Black and Brown students, who we know are our most vulnerable population within our schooling system, and we juxtapose the then and now in ways that were just so recent as a few weeks ago, we do need to sit with what has changed, because knowing this and sitting with this helps us begin to ask different questions as we build our equity-based MTSS. So go ahead and grab like a piece of paper or a whiteboard or something and something to write with. And just for a second, we'll give you a minute, just draw something that resembles how you're landing with this image that will give us space then to move on to the next. And you're not going to be sharing your image with anybody, just to think about what's coming up for you. Just an image, a picture. So when we started out today, we asked to, sit with being uncomfortable sometimes. But sometimes being uncomfortable begins us to think of the possibilities. And as we begin moving into this next section of, so now what? Right? There's a lot of times like we hear all this, we're like, okay, now what do we do? How do I be a leader in this space to build an equity-based multi-tiered system of support, RTI approach, PBS approach, whatever framework approach that you'd like to name it? It is about sitting with us for this next little bit and thinking about what if, and just kind of stay in the what if with us for a little bit, because that means that we could begin drawing some thinking. And again, this is going to be about asking different questions to build a more equitable system through an anti-racist approach. Hollie, as we begin to transition into the next section, is there anything you want to share about this part?
No, I mean, I just feel like we have to sit with this. We have to acknowledge it. And that I think is really important for me.
So, and again, feel free to use the chat anytime. We've got lots of links to folders, same folder over and over again. Thank you for that. But other things you might want to put in there. So now let's talk about this power of possibilities. And we're all trying to figure this out, right? Like, we wouldn't be having tons of conferences if we all had it figured out. Like, we're all coming together. That's what I love about this community, trying to build frameworks such as this, is that we're all leaning on each other to use the power of our experiences to help people build an equity-based multi-tiered system of support. So when we think about the power of possibilities, we want to just start with some common language from our perspective, so that way when we have acronyms, this is what we want to ask. What would it take for our system to meet the needs of each and every student? Now at Swift, for a while, we were known for the hashtag all means all. And then we recognized in our own learning that that's not what we're after, and that's not the message, because all leaves out some, though it's not intended to. One of my favorite questions to ask is, well, who are you not meeting the needs of, instead of who are you meeting the needs? Like that flip of the question, you'll see some of that today. And then around the system of support, it's about organizing all of our things and stuff to be effective and efficient, right? The system that we're trying to build is to build a system that is effective for the students because it's efficient for the adults. So building this effective and efficient system means we have to relook at how we organize our resources, organize things such as our time, our personnel, like what are we doing? Because we're building the system as adults for students to experience. And so we still have to continue to critique it to see where we've gone off course, and keeping in mind with what you just saw in the images of all these other spheres that are influencing our system of school in a very micro way as well.
Yeah, and Amy, I just want to add, this time of intersecting pandemics with COVID, with racism, with economic uncertainty, there's a lot that has kind of thrown some of our ways of work out the window. And if we play it right, if we use this as an opportunity, perhaps we can right some of the wrongs from a system that was built to not be equal, and really come back into school with that lens that is inclusive and that really does support each and every student and each and every educator.
So I'd love in the chat real quick if people could just put what role, and I know that no one has one hat of one role, but what role you have in where it is, and put like where you're from, like where you're from and your role. Just that helps us get a lens of this remote world to feel a little more connected. Great, thank you everybody for participating so quickly. I can't keep up with it.
Great cross section of role and geographic locations, and I'm excited that we have some breakouts planned so that folks can connect. There's a lot of knowledge in this room.
There is. This is great. Thank you very much. So that helps as we begin to, I'm just looking at the chat when you see me look the other way. I always feel like you're supposed to be looking at the screen, but you have so many screens up that you're still looking all over the place. So that helps framing this next piece is as we think about what it takes to build this equity-based MTSS. We're talking about what it means to be to have equity leadership skills, which means that we're all leaders in this work. As I look through the list, you all have extreme impact. When I say extreme, very powerful impact in where you sit in an organization. Having been school administrator, district, and state administrator, the supports to be a good leader just weren't really there in my learning. It was a lot of learning on the go and learning from other partners and learning from people just like you across the nation about how to really be in a leadership position and then putting equity at the forefront. So Hollie, can you talk us through this quote a little bit and point out what we highlighted with intention?
Yeah. So this quote is by Heifetz and Lindsay. And Heifetz writes a lot about the adaptive skills that a leader needs to have to truly meet the human needs of the work. And so this quote really resonated for Amy and I at this time, because I don't think anybody gets into a leadership role to not count. We're there because we have a moral imperative to make a difference. And so when you're in that kind of a role, you're living dangerously because you're leading people through challenges that challenge everything they do, what they hold dear, their habits, their tools, their loyalties, their ways of thinking. And what's really hard, especially when we're talking about creating an equitable school system, is we really are just selling an idea. Because to date, as a nation, we haven't had an equitable school system. So I like this quote, even though it's kind of old, it still really speaks to me in that the possibilities that are out there, if we educate all of our students well, they're worth it. They're worth being in some dangerous space.
And when Hollie and I chat about this, I think the smallest word that's highlighted is the one that sticks out for me daily. Like, this equity leadership lens is not a one-time event or a big event. It's what we critically question about the system we're building on a daily basis when we're making decisions, when we're looking at fidelity of a program implementation. Like, we have to just change that question on a daily basis in different places to be able to give different outcomes for our students. No one really told me about this when I was doing leadership previous to this job, so I kind of wished it was there. But also that idea that we get to create it. And so staying in that idea of possibility and the what if, again, just staying with us as we move into, we're gonna move into a breakout room here in a minute. But gosh, schools are messy. Schools are a messy place where we all come, and I'm going to put right, I mean, I know we're not some of you are brick and mortar, some are virtual, some are some conglomeration of hybrid or whatever we're going to call it approach. But we're all coming into this place called school, like grappling with our own identities. We all have implicit bias we're walking in with. And then we have this system that's been built on power, privilege, prejudice, and discrimination that we're trying to change, yet as the images we showed continue to put this force against us. And it's not just the adults going through this, it's like the little tiny humans going through this as well. And to add like one more layer, right now in our educational system, we have 4 generations of people who all have each of these areas experiences over different times in our history. And then like we all walk in this space together and say, hey, let's do school. And then as a leader in building this equity-based MTSS, it's like, how do we navigate this? And how do we ask these different questions? You're gonna hear me say it over and over again to, one, grapple with each of these, honor where people are, and then move the needle on outcomes for individuals and groups of kids. This image resonates with me a lot because I couldn't put into words when I was at a building level so much as like, why did I find it so hard? Like, what was so hard about it? Great staff, great community, like all that is just awesome. It's all this messiness that comes together. And also having been a previous gen ed teacher, I didn't know how to navigate this in my classroom when issues would come up. And so, but then as we look, we'll have to see what that impact has for students and how, when we're trying to work on engagement, what is it that we are putting forth?
Yeah, and Amy, I have to admit, I like complex. I chose the work that I chose because I like to do hard things. And I take a lot of satisfaction from grappling with hard things with a group and really seeing what can happen. So as I look at this, like, I get excited because I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many different angles we could take with this work. And I certainly hope that even though we're pointing out many flaws in the system, that those of you that are on the call are not getting the impression that Amy and I are saying, like, throw in your hat because it's over. What we're really saying is, let's know what our variables are and let's view all of these different generations as a resource. And how can we leverage the fact that millennials expect diversity in their work? And how can we leverage the fact that Generation Z has never had a world where data wasn't at their fingertips, where data wasn't pushed out to them immediately? You know, how can we really leverage those pieces to support all of the students and to support them all well?
So that brings us to some critical questions we can ask. These questions have become like the iconic questions. So there are 3 questions that now I know we apply to any place that we go, anything that we do in this work. Who will this, whatever you're trying to do, marginalize, and who will it benefit? And then what will be done to mitigate this impact? So let's say you're going to pick a new intervention program. Taking a look at the culturally sustaining pieces of it, maybe the UDL pieces of it, what it's teaching, how is the Generation Z that's experiencing it, how are we leveraging it? So now we just say, okay, fine, there's the evidence behind it, right? There's the evidence behind this thing we're going to implement. But now we add this new question to it. Who will this marginalize? Who will this benefit? And then what will be done to mitigate this impact? Scheduling, your schedule changes, your push-in times, your pull-out times, your who's teaching what, and you're going to hear this today, the places that we know we can leverage. So these questions right here, we have partners that we work with in our with Swift that have totally thinking about when we have they've put this on their agenda. They have put this at the top of their whatever they do, because when they're thinking about even student placement and they're having IEP discussions, they're adding this as another lens to change outcomes.
Yeah, and Amy, I feel like in equity work, there's sometimes this faulty notion that it's a zero-sum game, right? That if we adjust the schedule to be more inclusive, let's say we de-stratify classes at the middle level, that some students are going to lose and some students are going to win. And the truth of the matter is, we can create conditions where we don't have any winners or losers. We are able to universally support the students in our care. And so these questions, I think, help us to identify potential faulty notions as well, so that we can mitigate them in our work to implement what is best for kids.
So we want to play with this a little bit. So I'm imagining in the link for the folder. Thank you, Beth, for putting that link in there. In
right
the folder. That was like right on. There is a document, and I believe there should be, that looks something like that. I don't know where it went. It was here and now it's gone. It's like, you know how to present in person and then they give you 5 screens and you're trying to figure out how to find everything. So it is there because I just saw it and now it moved somewhere on my screen. So we're gonna put you into breakout rooms, and in your breakout rooms, one of our colleagues says it is called Scenarios PDF. Yes, thank you. One of our colleagues calls everybody now roomies. So we're using to greet your roomies, like, hey, just determine somebody, a recorder and a spokesperson. And when you get in there, just pull up the scenarios. And these scenarios are not made up. These are scenarios that as an organization, we sat around and said, what have we heard and worked with sites on? So as you're reading these, he's like, there is no way. Where did they come up with this? It's like, well, we lifted it from a site we worked with over the years. And just talk about, as you're looking through these scenarios, what does this make you think? What does it make you wonder? And like, just really thinking about, what is it about, who would this marginalize? Who would it benefit? And if I was in this place, could I mitigate it?
And
so
Amy,
this is,
I have ready to go. So I'm going to push people into their rooms. Just
oh, so good. Great. Then you go push them in.
Okay.
I lost the document. I should not be in charge anymore. Go ahead.
I shouldn't have interrupted you. I apologize for that. So I'm going to push you into your rooms. You know where the document is. It's in the chat, the link to the folder. And then these are the steps that we're hoping you'll be able to take during your breakout. So let's have an opportunity to think aloud.
Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully your travels were okay, but it looks like Zoom was having some problems too. So just add to the chaos. The person who was going to be the quote, the spokesperson, there was like 30 rooms and we really want to hear what you have to say, but we'd love to use the chat box for that. So the person who is the recorder, if you could put like 5 to 7 words, what was something that resonated in your group? Just throw it in the chat box, or anybody again, like what resonated with this around. And I see, I like the fact that we're talking
about now that you've looked at all those examples. You know, what was your group thinking about? What did you kind of settle on as wonderings that you had?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing in the chat box. Isolation, penalize students for cultural differences. Inequitable. Yep.
Why does transportation get to determine all services for kids? I've often wondered that when I was in large districts.
Yeah.
Yeah, who makes the decisions?
And then I saw a why in there. I think that why piece is kind of pulling back on the graphic with implicit bias and power privilege and also identity, and then with the images. So because there's this idea that we can talk together, we do want to give you a minute to think about what could you bring from this bit that we just went through. What would you like to question back at your site? I'm just going to write it down. We're not going breakout rooms or anything. But based on what you were reading, what made you go like, I wonder if we have something like that at our school, or I wonder if I asked who our schedule marginalizes, who it benefits. Just where do you think these things are? Where would you like to question in your site? And just write down a couple ideas with those questions of who would it marginalize, who would it benefit?
Yeah, and I love that folks are popping some of their ideas in the chat. So if you want to put the questions that you'd like to carry on to your local setting in the chat, you're certainly welcome to do so.
I see Mitzi asking the why piece with the gatekeepers and the why. And Terry, you bring up a really good question. And I think that's something that we build a system that we have to ask. Does intervention / enrichment time, does it marginalize? Right? That's a really, really good question. Because I know we've all run like full speed at that one. Like, let's do it. Has to happen. Because people said it would work. I've been one of those people who said it would work. But does it? I don't know. I mean, does it work for your context? Is it creating more isolation? And that's why we're just asking questions differently. We're not going to keep asking the same questions, keep getting that same impact.
I kind of love Mitzi's question, like, why seems rhetorical, but is it? There's so many traditions that happen in schools that nobody really knows why. It just is what it is. And if we had the courage to grapple with why things are the way they are, I think we would be able to find solutions that would be more helpful.
Can share one of our colleagues went to go visit a high school before we started a partnership. Obviously, it was pre-pandemic. And when she walked into this school, there was a sign there was a contest coming up, a yearly contest that the school had every year for the best legs contest. And so our colleague was just having to sit with that, realizing I'm trying to build a relationship, right? Like first thing. But so the question that she starts asking is, what about your traditions? Right? Like what traditions do you have in place that might be playing on marginalization or ways of this way? So I think adding traditions to your vernacular is really good.
There's a question about the chat being visible. It isn't hidden, but it may you may need to kind of hunt a little on your screen to open it up if you're not able to see what folks are saying right now. I can't make it come prominent on your screen from my end.
Come on, Holly.
Though I would love to. So yes. As we talk about, like, leadership is really local, and that means that we're doing our dangerous work with the people that we see every day, which makes it even harder. The next step that we really have to think about at this point in time, is where do we pay our attention, and what resources can we strategically use to move us forward? And then this is a quote Amy and I use a lot, and it really is looking at who's at the table when decisions are made for a school, for a class, for a district. If we don't plan with our most vulnerable, our most marginalized, our most under-resourced students at the table, then everything we do is going to be retrofit. And retrofit is never the best way to go. It's not as stable, it's not as flexible, and it's not as effective. So we really have to start with everybody at the table to make those decisions. And we saw lots of comments about schedules, schedules in the day, schedules in the hour, schedules even across the school year. And those are the kind of conversations that are, I don't think this is culturally appropriate. I was going to call it a holy cow, but that are, people don't want to change. They feel sacred to people. But those are exactly the structures that we have the ability to change. And so thinking about everybody at the table and looking at our future, when we take that equity leadership from a local lens, we've got to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's going to most likely help us move forward.
Some of you have alluded to this quote. It's as if you could see the PowerPoint. And no, I just really appreciate it. Your master's schedule tells the story of the beliefs of your school. It puts on paper what's valued, what's not valued. It calls it out. I've also been to sites where they don't even have a master schedule on paper, which then I think also says things, because then it's, what are we not prioritizing? The master, just like, I don't know, anybody create a master schedule before? And I've described it as feeling like I was given a puzzle of 1,000 pieces and it's all blue and my dog ate one. Because no matter what, right when I'm done, I'm going to get 2/3 0.5 of a half of teacher who can only come on the third odd day of the month for an hour and has to see these 7 kids no matter what. And it's just mind blowing. So the question that we ask when we think about building an equitable MTSS is, who are you building it for? But maybe more importantly, who are you not building it for, which adds to that quote from this previous slide. Who is the schedule not built for? And when you look at your master schedule, if we were to look at it, anybody to say, what do you prioritize? What is it that actually says this is what it means to be part? And what is not in the master schedule? So one of the most fascinating things about an elementary master schedule is transition times in elementary school don't exist on a master schedule. It's like a miracle. You can start and stop a subject at the exact same time. You can be teaching reading and then be in lunch immediately. You're just the kids go from one class to another magically transported to land to get their 45 minutes of instruction. In elementary school, the concept of transition is interesting. And so if we think about a resource of the master schedule, and what we pull into the master schedule is pulling in our resource of time. Time is our greatest free, underutilized resource that we have. Yet we splice it in ways that seem to not make sense. So let me kind of bring it down to a level that's kind of tangible. If you just, on a piece of paper, write the initials of a kid that you work with, have worked with, maybe it's your own kid, maybe it's your own kid's kid, I don't know, somebody that's in a school that you know or that you've observed or been around. And if you can think about, if you know what they're now I know we're in virtual and so things are different, but even virtual kids are getting timed differently. What is that even time? What does that day look like? Just gonna give you a second. And as we think of a kid, and we think of this, I want you to have this in mind. Oh, cool. I screwed up when I was playing with this, Hollie, I messed up the animations. Don't tell. And now I'm going, the presentation's not over, though it looks like it is based on my clicking. I love how you let me click every time we present together and somehow I screwed up. But this is what I want you to.
That tells you how inept I am at clicking, that you are infinitely better at it than I am.
Who knew that clicking would be the hardest part of this job? Does your school make sense from a student's perspective? Like, does it? When a kid goes from place 1 to place 2, subject 1 to subject 2, period 1 to period 2? What about, I mean, could I say from building level to building level? That's a leap sometimes, more so. But like if you were to think about in your school where you work or in your district, and let's say you have 3 kids in kindergarten, 3 different kids you're thinking about, and they're in the same classroom. And the next year, those 3 kids go to 3 different first grade teachers. Like, does each of the kids, like, does it make sense what they're getting, experiencing vertically? And then like, wow, when we think about when kids go these interventions, does it make sense can the adults talk about the connections? Right. Like I remember when I was teaching, it was like, oh wow, they left the room and came back all on their own and didn't get lost. That's awesome. But I had no idea what they quote did to come back for me to help apply it. Recently, I was working with a school and we did this activity, and a first grade teacher, this kid had 20 transitions every day. And if we said, okay, it's about 5 minutes of transition, roughly, 100 minutes of instructional time gone by walking around the building. And then she's like, you know what? I don't even know what route he takes. I mean, it might be more time. And she's like, we just met on this kid and said he struggles with transitions. What are we doing? But we have that scenario time and time again when we talk about groups of kids, individual kids. We have these moments when we can sit and ask, does our building make sense from a student's perspective? What we typically find is a disconnected educational experience for our already most marginalized population of kids. They're the ones who move the most, who have the most teachers. Our students learning English as a second language get like 5 times more of the vocabulary than students who aren't and trying to make sense of it all instead of corralling behind what vocabulary we're trying to have them use. And it becomes this very disconnected experience.
So for this second breakout, we're going to try really hard to do a different model to see if we can meet your needs. I will open up breakout rooms and you can select your own. So you'll just go over, see a breakout room. We're trying to keep the groups to 4 or 5 so that folks have enough time to have a conversation. You know, we notice that if we get a little bit beyond 4 or 5, it feels like a crowd. And we want you to be able to talk through the student that you selected, the ahas that you have. You know, what are you wondering? What questions do you have for that student? So I'm going to open up 35 rooms. I'm going to cross my fingers and click my heels and hope it happens.
Welcome back, everybody. We had, shockingly, we had some Zoom issues. So let's just debrief a little bit large group, which is going to be the opposite of intimate. But what's standing out for you? And you can use a chat. You can come off a mic.
I think
probably.
Sorry. Hey, I think there was an issue with our room 17.
Yeah, we all had issues, so we just came back to do it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, there's so many issues.
Circle back up together. We're going to have an intimate breakout session of 175.
Let's just blame COVID. All right.
So what's standing out to you about this journey of a student? Does your building make sense? What's coming up for you?
I am recently not in a building, but speaking to the last traditional building I was in before we launched our hybrid school.
I think the statement about the master schedule is huge. I used to say that the master schedule is where I see your values. Oh, yeah. I know what you hold most true in that, to do that, but I think you're right about that idea of when you gave the example of, you know, the child's having a hard time with transitions, but yet he has 20 transitions a day. Right. I don't even have 20 transitions. I mean, I probably do, but I'm an adult. So I think we just really need to think about what we're asking our students to do, and are we really asking them with all the knowledge and awareness that is happening? And are we as empathetic? Are we practicing the empathy that we say that we are around that? So I think that's a big piece.
Yeah, I like the idea that Brian has about using chat. Some people can't see their chat since like 1018. So it's just another curveball with Zoom that we get to navigate as well. So I appreciate the complexity. From an EC perspective, the master schedule is so difficult to work with.
Yeah.
You know, this is something that, an activity that you could do with, and Hollie, you used this phrase for me earlier, so I'm going to stop my sentence and change to this one. You talked about earlier in our meeting about routines and arrangements. Mm-hmm. Can you say more about that? Because you had talked about that with me this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I think we get these lofty ideas when we're in these kind of sessions where we talk about policy. And truthfully, the average person isn't able to set their own policy. We impact it, we inform it, but what we do have control over are the routines and arrangements in our environment, in our classroom, in our small groups, in our school district. And so I think as I look at the journey of a student, and it's interesting because I'm an old mom, so I had my kids later in life. And so I thought I kind of understood the experience of a student until I had students of my own. And then I realized, no, there's this other layer on top of Hollie that you didn't understand in education. And so I feel like looking at the routines and arrangements, those are things we can easily change. We can easily change quickly, and they truly are daily decisions.
And I think when you put it in that context, then it's allows for a little more empowerment, which I appreciate. And this idea of journey of a student, I want you to think about, add anything that you'd like to ask questions about. Like we had that from before after we talked about the 2 questions you want to ask, or like the question about who's going to benefit, who's marginalized, maybe what policies you want to question. And now, is there anything else you want to add to that list of things to look at your own site? And there are so many opportunities to begin manipulating around with our resources of time, of scheduling. You know, one activity that highlights this too is if you take your actual calendar of a school year, and then you cross off the days that aren't instructional days to come up with the actual calendar, not the one that they post and say is the calendar, because that's just days that, and many of them, we don't have instructional days for. And like you're left with like, how many instructional days do we have? Like how many hours is that actually? And begin doing some like backward mapping with what can we do with this time to leverage? And then how are we as the adults spending the kids' proposed academic engaged time minutes? That's what's asking questions differently, is how are we building a system for the students to experience? And follow a kid vertically and horizontally in your building and your site. Does it make sense? You know, Mitzi, you're asking about scheduling intervention groups and teachers would be ask these questions around, like, what do they think? And then why are you, like, how you can ask questions around your personnel, right? Like do we have our most skilled individuals teaching our most vulnerable populations?
Yeah, and I want to pop in just another plug for the resources on our website. We've spent a lot of time talking about different components of a system that could support all students. At the end of this presentation, we do have resources linked, and one of them is a master scheduling tool. So a tool to help with these kind of conversations at the local level. There's also a tool in there that is a tiered intervention matrix, which is looking at exactly what y'all are putting in the chat, that our students who have the highest needs, our students who are the most under-resourced, our students who come from the most marginalized communities also have the most sliced and diced schedules and sliced and diced experiences in education. So a tiered intervention matrix can help you connect those dots.
Thanks for pointing that out, Holly, and you're always good at making sure that I'm coming back to reality. And I see many of my previous North Carolina friends on here who could relate to that and probably feel your pain.
I love your world, so I'll stay here anytime.
I see that Jennifer had her hand up. I think she had gotten cut off before.
Oh, okay.
Can you guys hear me? I wasn't sure if my.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Well, you were asking about the journey of the student, but I think it's important to step back when we talk about equity work and look at this as something that should happen 100% of the time in 100% of our classes. And I keep hearing it discussed in intervention, which I'm not saying it doesn't belong higher up on the triangle too, but to think that it doesn't belong at the 100% level of the triangle, I think is a real lack of self-awareness that we all share. And I don't mean to put that on everybody else, but I would say starting with acknowledging our own bias and thinking about what we do every day in every class, because we may not know, we all need this work. I shouldn't even say that. We all need this work, starting with the adults. But of course, we need to jump into it now in the way that we are trying to work through it. But I just think it's something that just needs to be 100% of the time, 100% of the classes, 100% of the kids, because it's not just kids that are in these in intervention classes. And at the elementary, you asked the life of a kid. I've taught high school, elementary, and middle, and been an administrator too. And I was shocked when I coached in the elementary at the experience of kids who were pulled out for interventions. It was like their heads had to just be spinning, and they were missing so much rich instruction that every child deserves while they were going to those. So anyways, off my soapbox, but
thank you for sharing that.
That's my thinking.
Yeah, and I just in the chat, I noticed there are some really cool comments there. So I'm not trying to make those of you who can't see the chat right now feel bad or have FOMO, but there's a lot of comments about like, how are we engaging stakeholders in these decisions that we're making? How are we addressing their needs, not from a lens of we know what's best, but from a lens of what the true experience is. And Amy, there was a lot of comments about how equity shouldn't be an add-on. It shouldn't be this standalone, one thing we do. It really is everything we do.
And I put this quote back up in, Jennifer, thanks for pointing it out. We didn't intentionally call this quote out, but it is where we're ending today. And we're going to get cut off in 3 minutes, I've been told. So that's going to be a harsh ending and not kind if we just say, see ya.
Show them what we have in the deck, maybe.
Yeah, so obviously you have access to all this. You have a way to get a hold of us. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, feel free. There is a book. It's actually one of the books that's holding up my computer. Two of our folks, Dawn Miller and Amy McCart, wrote Leading Equity-Based MTSS, and that's where a lot of our work comes from. So that resource is there. And then there's the resources that Holly was chatting about also here for you to take a look at. We can say that the one thing that I know Holly and I have chatted about over the years, we haven't even been working together for a year, is that we believe that, so SWIFT goes with a strengths-based approach. We like to find out and help you figure out what's working well, how you got that thing to work so well, and then how can we use those lessons to find out, well, now what do you want to work on next, which is a different way than I've done my work before. Yeah. So Tara, you're seeing one slide.
I've got her. Keep going.
Okay. So, I mean, that's what we have today to share with you. I just see, we want you to ask different questions. When you're ask different, if the only thing you take away is asking, who will this benefit? Who will it marginalize? What will we do to mitigate it? It will change the way that you build your system and push on it. So I don't know if anybody can put things in the chat. If you can't see the chat, come off the mic, but we do appreciate all that you do. We appreciate your work in here. We appreciate being in this thing called school with you. And we're here as partners in the work. And we learn from you. So we want to, when we see everybody tweeting with tagging this conference, I know I'll be following you. So thanks so much. And to all my North Carolina friends, so good to see you. Miss you guys.